June 4, 1942. Somewhere in the Central Pacific, thousands of miles from Washington and Tokyo, the war paused for a fraction of a second. Not on the ocean's surface, where carriers maneuvered and aircraft clawed for altitude, but inside a darkened room aboard an American ship, where a single radar screen refused to behave as expected. For months, the Pacific War had followed a brutal pattern. Japan struck first, Japan struck faster, and Japan struck with a confidence built on a string of unstoppable victories. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. Each battle reinforced the same belief within the Imperial Navy that surprise and speed decided everything. Darkness protected fleets, distance shielded carriers. Information arrived too late to matter. Midway was supposed to follow the same script. 4 Japanese fleet carriers were approaching an isolated atoll that barely registered on most maps. The American carriers were expected to be far away, still reeling from earlier defeats. If the Japanese plan worked, Midway would be destroyed, the American fleet drawn out, and the Pacific tilted permanently toward Tokyo. But war does not always announce its turning points with explosions. Sometimes it reveals them quietly, through hesitation, confusion, or a machine behaving in an unexpected way. In the early hours of that morning, American radar operators watched their scopes as they had been trained to do. Blips appeared, faded, and reappeared. Aircraft came in low, vanished behind curvature and interference, then returned. The screen should have been clean, predictable. Instead, it showed something unsettling. The pattern did not match Japanese expectations, and it did not match American assumptions either. That frozen moment on a glowing screen did not sink a carrier. It did not fire a gun. But it told the United States Navy something no intelligence report had ever confirmed before. The enemy was closer. The margin for error was gone. And the war, for the first time since it began, was no longer moving according to Japanese design. The Pacific had stopped obeying certainty. By the spring of 1942, the Pacific War appeared settled in Japan's favor. In less than 6 months, the Imperial Navy had dismantled Western naval power across half the globe. British battleships lay on the bottom of the South China Sea. American airfields burned from Wake to the Philippines. The myth of Japanese invincibility was no longer propaganda, it was experience. At the center of that confidence stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He understood America better than most of his peers. He knew its industrial strength, its population, and its capacity for prolonged war. That knowledge frightened him. Yamamoto believed Japan could win only by destroying the United States Navy quickly and decisively. Not by attrition, but by shock so severe that Washington would negotiate rather than rebuild. Midway was designed to deliver that shock. The atoll sat astride the approaches to Hawaii, a symbolic and strategic prize. If Japan could seize it, American defenses would be pushed back another 1,000 miles, and the psychological echo of Pearl Harbor would be renewed. But Midway was never the real target. The real objective was the American carrier force itself. Yamamoto believed the Americans would react predictably. Midway would be attacked. American carriers would rush forward to defend it. Japanese submarines and reconnaissance aircraft would detect them. Then, the carriers of the First Air Fleet would strike and destroy them in open water, repeating the logic that had worked so flawlessly at Pearl Harbor and in the Indian Ocean. What Yamamoto did not fully grasp was how fragile that logic had become. Japanese operational planning still assumed that information flowed slowly and imperfectly. Radar, to Japanese doctrine, was auxiliary. Visual scouting, night optics, and human judgment remained supreme. Detection was expected to come from float planes, picket submarines, and wide search arcs flown by reconnaissance aircraft. If something was missed, it could be corrected later. The Americans were operating under different assumptions. Since the Coral Sea, they had begun to accept that they would always be outnumbered. Victory would depend on knowing where the enemy was first, even if that knowledge was incomplete. Radar was no longer experimental. It was becoming instinctive. Operators trusted screens, even when they contradicted expectation. At Midway, the American fleet was already wounded. Yorktown had been hastily repaired. Enterprise and Hornet carried air groups still learning how to fight together. There was no margin for hesitation. If detection came late, there would be no second chance. The battle was not yet about bombs or torpedoes. It was about belief. Japan believed the enemy would reveal himself when forced. America believed the enemy could be found before he understood he had been seen. That difference would decide everything. Long before the first aircraft lifted from Japanese carrier decks, the battle for Midway was already taking shape in silence. It unfolded through estimates, assumptions, and search patterns drawn on charts that looked convincing and felt complete. To the Japanese planners, the ocean ahead appeared empty. To the Americans, it was crowded with possibility. Japanese reconnaissance doctrine relied on distance and timing. Float planes, launched from cruisers, would sweep wide arcs. Submarines would form a picket line east of Midway. Carrier aircraft would scout in layered patterns once the atoll was struck. If American carriers approached, they would be detected in time to organize a crushing counterstrike. This system had worked before. It had never failed completely. That confidence remained intact on the morning of June 4th. But the system contained small fractures that no one noticed until it was too late. Several Japanese submarines arrived late to their assigned positions. Others reported nothing, not because the sea was empty, but because the enemy was already where Japanese doctrine did not expect him to be. American carriers were closer than assumed, operating under radio silence, relying on radar and intelligence rather than forward scouting. Inside American ships, radar operators watched the sea in ways no human lookout could match. Their screens did not show ships clearly, they showed absence and anomaly. Contacts appeared where no contacts should exist. Aircraft approached at altitudes that broke pattern. Blips lingered, then vanished, then returned again. The screens did not tell them everything, but they told them enough to know that the Japanese timetable was flawed. At Midway itself, radar stations on the atoll detected incoming Japanese aircraft well before visual contact. This was not new technology, but it was being used with new confidence. Controllers vectored fighters toward enemy formations rather than waiting to react. Every early warning reduced uncertainty by minutes. In carrier warfare, minutes mattered more than numbers. The most critical failure came from a single delayed launch. A Japanese cruiser float plane, responsible for searching the sector where American carriers actually lay, took off late. When it finally reported sighting enemy ships, its message was incomplete and uncertain. It mentioned cruisers, it did not mention carriers, and it arrived at the worst possible moment. By then, Japanese carrier decks were crowded with aircraft. Bombers armed for a second strike against Midway sat beside fighters, waiting for new orders. The assumption that the American fleet was distant had shaped every decision up to that point. Changing course now would mean rearming, refueling, and reorganizing under pressure. The trap was not a clever deception. It was simpler. Two sides were operating under different understandings of time. The Americans believed they were already late. The Japanese believed they still had hours. Radar did not shout, it whispered. And in those whispers, the shape of disaster was already visible. Inside the Japanese carrier force, the morning of June 4th unfolded as a series of reasonable decisions built on one fatal assumption. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo believed the American carriers were still far away. Every report he had received reinforced that belief, or at least failed to challenge it clearly. In war, uncertainty does not paralyze leaders. It pushes them to rely on what they think they know. Nagumo's first strike against Midway had already launched and was now returning. The attack had damaged installations but failed to neutralize the airfields completely. This created a problem that doctrine had prepared him for. If Midway was still operational, it required a second strike. That meant rearming aircraft on deck with land attack weapons. It was a logical response, executed many times before. Then, the late reconnaissance report arrived. The message was ambiguous. Enemy ships had been sighted, but their composition was unclear. Cruisers were confirmed, carriers were not. The report did not demand immediate reversal. It invited interpretation. Nagumo hesitated, not because he was indecisive, but because he was cautious. Launching an anti-ship strike without clear identification risked wasting aircraft and fuel. Waiting risked something worse. While Nagumo weighed his options, his carriers entered a moment of maximum vulnerability. Aircraft were scattered across hangar decks. Bombs and torpedoes were being moved, armed, and disarmed. Fuel lines ran openly. This was the most dangerous phase of carrier operations, a moment that required time and calm to pass safely. On American carriers, there was no such calm. Radar and intelligence had told their commanders that they were already behind schedule. Their strike aircraft launched in fragments, without coordination, without escort, and often without hope of return. Torpedo squadrons flew at wave-top height into overwhelming defenses, knowing they were unlikely to survive. They were not attacking to win, they were attacking to hold attention. Human judgment now operated under opposite pressures. Japanese commanders believed they still controlled the tempo. American commanders believed time was almost gone. Those beliefs shaped every decision that followed. Nagumo finally ordered his aircraft rearmed again for anti-ship attack. It was the correct order, issued too late. The process could not be reversed instantly. Deck crews worked furiously to comply, but machines and procedures obeyed physics, not urgency. Above the fleet, American dive bombers were lost, scattered, and nearly out of fuel. Many pilots believed the mission had failed. Then, by chance and persistence rather than planning, they found the Japanese carriers. At that moment, doctrine, training, and experience ceased to matter. The outcome no longer depended on numbers or formation. It depended on timing. And timing had slipped beyond Japanese control. The first American dive bombers arrived over the Japanese fleet just after 10:20 in the morning. They did not come as a coordinated strike. They came alone, exhausted, and nearly invisible against the sun. For most of the Japanese crews below, there was no warning. Radar coverage was focused outward, scanning for distant threats. The danger was already overhead. For nearly an hour, Japanese fighters had been drawn downward, chasing American torpedo planes, flying low and slow across the water. Those attacks had failed completely in material terms. Torpedoes missed. Squadrons were destroyed. Pilots died in burning aircraft that never reached their targets. But their sacrifice achieved something more important. It emptied the sky above the fleet. When the dive bombers appeared, the Japanese carriers were still caught in transition. Aircraft filled the hangar decks. Fuel hoses lay connected. Bombs and torpedoes sat unsecured. This was the exact vulnerability carrier doctrine was designed to avoid. It existed not because of incompetence, but because earlier assumptions had delayed a decision by minutes that could not be recovered. The first bombs struck Akagi and Kaga almost simultaneously. One penetrated Akagi near the aft elevator, igniting fueled aircraft below. Another tore through Kaga's hangar deck, setting off a chain reaction that no damage control team could stop. Within moments, flames raced through enclosed spaces, fed by aviation fuel and exposed munitions. Soryu was hit minutes later. Her fate was sealed just as quickly. Fires spread faster than crews could respond. Communications failed. Internal passages filled with smoke and heat. Commanders lost situational awareness almost instantly. What had been the most powerful carrier force ever assembled ceased to function as a weapon. From the American perspective, the moment felt unreal. Pilots later described seeing ships frozen beneath them, decks crowded, fighters absent. It was not resistance they remembered, it was stillness. Admiral Nagumo's flagship was now burning. 3 carriers were mortally wounded. Only Hiryu remained operational. In less than 5 minutes, the strategic balance of the Pacific had shifted. No signal announced it. No report summarized it. The war did not end that morning, but the belief that Japan controlled its direction did. What radar and intelligence had suggested hours earlier was now undeniable. The enemy was not reacting anymore. He was suffering consequences. The screen had not lied. It had warned. What followed the destruction of the first 3 Japanese carriers did not feel like victory to those who witnessed it. It felt unstable, unfinished, and dangerous. Smoke columns marked burning ships, but the battle was not over. Hiryu, the last surviving carrier of the First Air Fleet, was still intact, still capable of striking back. For the men aboard American carriers, relief was tempered by the knowledge that one successful counterattack could still reverse everything. Hiryu's commander acted quickly. Within hours, his aircraft found Yorktown. Bombs struck first, knocking the carrier dead in the water. Damage control teams fought fires and restored power with astonishing speed. Yorktown resumed flight operations long enough to launch her own strike before a second wave arrived. Torpedoes followed, tearing open her hull and forcing abandonment. To Japanese aviators, it appeared that 2 separate American carriers had been crippled. In reality, they had struck the same wounded ship twice. This confusion mattered. It suggested to Japanese command that American strength was greater than it truly was, reinforcing the sense that something fundamental had shifted beyond calculation. American radar and intelligence quickly located Hiryu. By late afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet found her decks crowded with recovering aircraft. Bombs struck with devastating effect. Fires spread uncontrollably. By nightfall, Hiryu was a burning wreck. She would be scuttled the following day. By sunset on June 4th, 4 Japanese fleet carriers were lost. More than 200 experienced aircrew were dead. These were not easily replaced pilots. They represented years of training, combat experience, and institutional memory. The loss was not just material, it was intellectual. American losses were real and painful. Yorktown was mortally wounded. Squadrons had been annihilated. Pilots who survived landed in the ocean with empty fuel tanks, never to be recovered. The victory carried a cost that was visible immediately to those who paid it. No one celebrated aboard the American ships that night. There were no cheers, only exhaustion and disbelief. Officers reviewed reports in silence. Sailors watched fires burn on the horizon, aware that they were witnessing something rare in war, a decisive outcome that still felt fragile. The balance had shifted, but it had not settled. The war was not won. It had simply stopped moving in one direction. That alone was enough. The realization did not arrive with panic in Tokyo or celebration in Washington. It emerged slowly, through after-action reports, missing squadrons, and the absence of familiar voices. By the morning of June 5, 1942, both sides understood that Midway had not been a normal battle. Something essential had been removed from the war. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the loss went beyond 4 carriers. It was the destruction of an idea. For decades, Japanese naval doctrine had rested on the belief that a smaller force, if better trained and more aggressively handled, could defeat a larger opponent. Midway shattered that confidence. The aircrews lost there were the veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, and the Indian Ocean. Their replacements would be fewer, less experienced, and increasingly cautious. Admiral Yamamoto grasped the implications immediately. He ordered a withdrawal, abandoning the Midway operation entirely. There would be no second attempt. The risks had become unacceptable. From that point forward, Japanese strategy shifted from initiative to reaction. Each subsequent operation would be shaped by fear of losing what little remained. On the American side, the realization was quieter but no less profound. Commanders understood that they had not won through superior force. They had won through information, timing, and the willingness to act on imperfect knowledge. Radar, intelligence, and decentralized decision-making had proven decisive in ways that no pre-war exercise had predicted. The carrier war would continue for years. Many battles lay ahead, but after Midway, the United States no longer planned around delay and defense. It began to plan around pressure. The assumption that Japan could strike anywhere, anytime, without warning was gone. What froze on that radar screen hours before the first bomb fell was not just a pattern of aircraft, it was the illusion of inevitability. The war would still be long, it would still be costly, but it would no longer belong to the side that struck first. Midway marked the moment when control slipped from hands that believed it permanent. The Pacific had learned how to hesitate. When historians later searched for the exact moment the Pacific War turned, they did not find it in a single explosion or a sinking hull. They found it in the space between certainty and doubt. At Midway, that space lasted only minutes, but it was enough to redirect history. The radar screen that confused American operators on the morning of June 4th did not predict victory. It did something more subtle. It challenged expectation. It suggested that the enemy was closer than planned, faster than assumed, and already inside the margins of error. In earlier wars, such uncertainty might have been dismissed. At Midway, it was acted upon. Radar did not win the battle alone. Courage did not win it alone. Luck did not win it alone. The turning point came from the willingness to trust incomplete information and move anyway. That mindset would define the rest of the war. American commanders learned that perfect clarity was not required to act decisively. Japanese commanders learned, too late, that control could vanish without warning. After Midway, the Pacific became a different kind of battlefield. Carriers no longer sought decisive encounters under ideal conditions. They hunted opportunities. Detection replaced surprise as the most valuable currency of war. The side that saw first did not always win, but the side that failed to see often lost everything. For the men who fought there, Midway was not remembered as a triumph. Survivors spoke of confusion, loss, and disbelief. Many never understood how close defeat had been. They only knew that something fragile had held long enough to change the direction of events. The frozen radar screen did not announce the future. It revealed the present. It showed that the war was no longer governed by momentum or myth. It would be decided by those who could accept uncertainty and still move forward. At Midway, the Pacific War did not end. It learned how to change direction, and once it did, it never turned back.